I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Arcane Mark.
Welcome to Player Tools Consumables. Consumable items are one of the types of items that, honestly, in just about any game, can be one of the trickiest, most troublesome types of items that you ever find. And that's for a variety of reasons, both game design reasons and psychological reasons. And, the psychological reasons become game design reasons, and it makes a complicated stew of competing factors that determine whether or not consumables are going to be something that give you a ton of power to your group or something you almost never use. It's very, very tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes back to a few things. Let's start with the Mega Elixir problem.
Yes, the classic Mega Elixir problem is the issue where you get an item and it's just so good and you say, oh my gosh, I have this item, it's amazing, I really have to save it for the right moment. And then, this would be in, Final Fantasy games, right, where you get, Mega Elixirs, which heal you all of your hit points and magic and all these kinds of things, and then you get to the final encounter and you're like, I guess I've got 4 Mega Elixirs and I didn't really need them. So you had this thing that you had as a save for an emergency button, but then you never used it, so it didn't actually have value.
Yeah, absolutely. And that psychological factor can make consumables very tricky to handle because you don't want to use it. You feel like you've lost value when the consumable has been used. You feel like you're storing up, you're saving, maybe I'll need it more later, and so the consumable becomes something that you are just going to hoard, and you get more and more and more of them, and eventually you just have so many consumables, you don't know what to do with them anymore. So, hi Aleph, hi everybody.
Hello.
who's in here. We're talking about consumables, hoarding, and the Mega Elixir problem. So another issue that can come with consumables is the opposite end, and this is why consumables are one of the trickiest possible types of items to handle, compared to permanent items are much easier to balance in a lot of ways because of the fact that once you've bought them, you can get their effects, and then that's it. You have the effects until you sell the items, and that is when consumable items are so inexpensive that they essentially are free.
Yeah, that it becomes and then from a balance perspective, it becomes like having a permanent item that does that because you just continually can have that benefit or that bonus at all times.
Or an infinite number of permanent items.
Yes.
Sort of. If you're talking about a situation where every encounter you drops 700 gold pieces and an item costs 3 gold pieces, suddenly you could just buy pretty much as many of those as you want, and you will not notice it in terms of your actual purchasing power.
So to go back to that, when I was saying kind of like a permanent item, that would be more for if it was something that provides a bonus. But to elaborate on what you were getting into there, then that would be if a permanent item might be once per day you can blah blah blah. But then you have the consumable version that's just do blah blah blah, and then you have 20 of those in your backpack. Then that's having.
Yeah, I was thinking of it as having. Yeah, if you buy 20 of that item every day, that's like having 20 ones.
Yeah.
Obviously, eventually it is cheaper to buy 20 ones, depending on how many days you go off in the adventure. But the trick is that you only need to use the 20, the time when you need 20. And the time when you need 3 is the time when you need 3.
Yeah, and then if the game is balanced at a point that doesn't assume you're doing this consumable spam, then it becomes very easy for the folks who are doing it. But then if it's balanced to assume that people are doing the consumable spam, then people who aren't using that particular trick are gonna, particularly new players who you really got to make sure the game is going to be welcoming to, are going to
absolutely
have challenges.
So welcome Bailtech. We're one person off from a hype train if anybody else subscribes or puts in some bits.
So how did these considerations inform the design of consumable items in Pathfinder 2nd Edition?
So one of the ways that they did is that they basically have you trapped between a rock and a hard place, because no matter what you do with consumables, you're going to have both the mega elixir problem and the spamming problem of low level consumables. Now, this is particularly the case due to the fact that, based on the way that monsters scale, such that like a level 4 monster is about twice considered to be twice as strong as a level 2 monster in terms of like XP budget, and a level 6 is twice as strong as level 4. That also winds up meaning that experience and treasure need to roughly double every 2 levels, because otherwise, if monsters come with treasure on them and you know that that value is safe for a level 8 monster when it's like a singleton boss monster, it may not be safe when you're throwing 12 of them at a high level party, or vice versa. And so because of that fact, that that brings in the value scaling, which means that, like, oh my gosh, whatever value you pick at level 1, by the time you get to level 19, things are going to be like, what, 248, 1632, 64, 128, 512 times more valuable about.
Yeah.
And so you're always going to have that issue if gold pieces are the only way to determine whether or not you can use an item. And due to that fact, you wind up in a sort of stuck. So you have the mega elixir problem where it's too valuable to use. And even if it's not that valuable, I sometimes have a mega elixir problem where I won't use it anyway.
Yeah.
And I know other people do too, and I'm not the only one.
I know. I'm just thinking about like the end of our campaigns. We have these. Our home group typically manages treasure with spreadsheets so that everyone can Google Doc spreadsheets so everyone can see them, and then it's like, all right, here's our giant list of consumables. Like, seriously, we should probably use some of these, or like going through and being like, okay, you know what? I'm thinking about first edition game right now, where we were like, we're gonna section things off and be like, these are the things we sat on so long that they're not even valuable anymore. Let's sell those, and then let's buy more of the ones that like we know we're gonna constantly use, like Breath of Life scrolls.
So the real secret to solving this seemingly unsolvable issue where things seem too valuable to use them when they're like right when you first get them, and then they become so cheap you can just spam them all, is actually that you have to break outside the box. And that is why I think that the idea that that Logan Bonner had during the playtest to create something called Resonance, that was a non-gold piece level sort of thing that tamped down on the use of consumables, was a way that could help us to escape from that otherwise inevitable trap of consumables being in a weird place where maybe they are the worst of both worlds, and people don't like them as much as they should, but they're also really powerful if for the few people who know how to use them. And the idea there is just that you add a daily limit on how many you could use, which prevents the low-level spam. It lets them be more powerful in terms of what they can do because of the spam being avoided, and cheaper.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, everybody hated it. So
that one didn't work.
And even the people who didn't hate it said it would be fine as long as we get rid of it for potions, while meanwhile potions and consumables were the number one place where it needed to be.
Yeah.
So, therefore, that is not in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So let's talk about tips and tricks for what actually is in the game. But I did want to answer because you asked a question about, like, how do you get around it? Now, there is another way that you can somewhat get around it. You can see in many modern games, and there are other games that did this before Dark Souls, but the Souls-like Estus Flask idea is one that really caught on and that people use to describe this, which is the idea of people don't like to use a consumable that you use it and it is gone, but in the game Dark Souls, there is a type of healing flask called Estus Flask that when you go back to the campfire, you heal up to full, all the monsters come back, and you get back all of your flasks. So it becomes not a, you use it, it's gone, consumable resource, it becomes a renewable resource. The Estus Flasks are essentially kind of like a daily ability. They come back just the same as your spells in that game, which are also one that you use, and then when you go back, they might as well be a spell. They aren't, though. People still think of them as an item because they come in a flask.
Yeah. And so that would be like, for example, the alchemist class, who has that daily pool of regenerating consumables.
That's right. So you'll see, and we're gonna go through every consumable type one by one. But there's the alchemist class, and there's the ability to get more gadgets for the inventor. There's some classes that come with that Estus Flask-like mechanic built in. And if you don't have one of those classes, but you know that like you always are gonna Mega Elixir, there's also a little something that I wrote for Treasure Vault, and that is in there about gardens that you can, and they don't have to be literal physical gardens.
Mm-hmm.
I gave one example that was like a scriptorium with like weird mummy and fiend piece, like a contract, double contracts, and they make like divine items, little scripts of divine items each day. But the idea is that it essentially grows consumables for you that only last for that day, and you can use them essentially like the alchemist ability or the inventor ability or whatever, except balanced with gold pieces and based on the difference in price between wands versus scrolls.
And that's that is so connected to the idea of what Pathfinder Society has been doing of giving people a free consumable at the beginning of adventures. That there's a recent blog where folks talk about the gardens as sort of the explanation for why in-world explanation for why Pathfinder Society has these items, and that's why Pathfinder Society wound up doing that in the first place, is trying to like both show that the society cares about its agents, and also to find a way to make it easier for people to engage with consumable items without worrying about that problem, and then help introduce them to that aspect of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's not surprising that multiple different people came up with a similar idea, because it's just generally a good idea for helping with that. But let's suppose you're not using gardens and you're not getting them from your class already. What's the deal with consumables, and when would you want to use them? Well, other than having a really expensive consumable that you can use as sort of like a ace up your sleeve, that you're like, ah ha ha, I have this giant consumable. In general, because of the way the price scaling goes, you should be looking at low-level consumables that still have an outsized benefit even at higher levels, because you'll find that those can be potentially remarkably powerful. And we're going to go through all the different types of consumables, and then talk about the ways that you can stock those up, have those ready to use for your character so that you can get the best bang out of it for your character. So there's several types of consumables in the game. Ones we're going to be looking at are Fulu, gadgets, magic ammunition, oils, potions, scrolls, spell catalysts, talismans, and other consumables. All right. So, Fulu is the first alphabetically, but is actually a pretty complicated category of items, because they are essentially from a type of real-world paper talisman that is from Chinese tradition. There are many other Asian traditions that have a somewhat different name for them, for something very similar to them, like Ofuda. But Fulu in Pathfinder are a little more complicated, because like some of them are talismans, but some of them are not talismans.
Why don't we talk about
let's talk about
first?
Talismans first. But
Yes.
I wanted to get out of the way of why we're not doing it in alphabetical order, because it's a little more complicated because of the traditional uses of them in Chinese folklore didn't match the definition of talismans, so they couldn't all be talismans, essentially. So let's talk about talismans. They're one of the items that are the most misunderstood in Pathfinder. They're the ones that are like the most different, in that like potions are like everywhere in pop culture, and you know what they're gonna do just right off the tin. Scrolls, at least in D&D likes, have been doing what they do for a long time, and even then in other pop culture you see them. But talismans are something that Pathfinder kind of has, and that most other people do not have something that's exactly this. Talismans are affixed to your armor or your weapon, very occasionally somewhere else. And it takes a long time to put a talisman on. That's sort of the balancing factor that allows the talismans to often have very, very, very good action economy for their actual usage, because it takes so long to put them on. You essentially, even if you've purchased thousands of talismans,
you can't have them all.
Yeah, you can only use like maybe one on your weapon and one on your armor per battle.
So I think the first thing about using talismans is once you get a talisman, affix it to someone's weapon or armor. Because, like, if you have a talisman and you haven't chosen where to put it, and then the battle comes up, it's like, oh, wait, we didn't use it, then you can't use it.
Yep, that's correct. So, you want to make sure it's affixed. Even if you think you're not going to use it, you should affix it to something. Yeah. Because you might as well have it as an option. And if it's just in your inventory and it's not affixed, then you don't even have it as an option. At that point, sell it. So, talismans are often underlooked because of that, but their action economy is the best in the game. Many of them are free actions that you could just use whenever the talisman will become relevant.
I saw a mention of owlbear claws in the chat.
I was going to point that out there, but an owlbear claw costs 3 gold pieces. When you crit, you can activate it to get the critical specialization effect. For if you are a class that does not have critical specialization, you can get a huge benefit out of the owlbear claw, because just for 3 gold, it's sitting, it's waiting for you to get a crit when the crit matters, when it's not going to just drop the opponent that you hit with the crit, because certain enemies are just going to be dead or so close that you don't need to do the critical.
Because it doesn't automatically activate, you choose when you want to.
But you just were like, oh, well, this is I actually rolled a 20 on the big boss. I guess I'd like to trip them. I'll pay. So, like, it's a free action. It just comes up. And that's sort of the best way to use talismans. Now, I believe there's, like, a pretty hokey thing that you can do with weapon talismans, especially now. So, a lot of the items that allow you to, like, pair up your property runes onto weapons are limited in some way. But if you know what you're doing, you can use them, especially the new throwing one from Treasure Vault, but even the regular doubling runes, in order to wind up having a bunch of weapons that are fixed to talismans. And if you have quick draw, you can just, like, keep pulling out talisman affixed weapons. So, like, imagine, for example, you are a longsword and shield person with quick draw, right? I just picked an arbitrary weapon. It can be whatever you want. Your actual runes are on your shield boss. They're not on the longsword. And then you have, like, a backpack full of... And you're someone who doesn't have critical specialization. You have a backpack full of longswords with owlbear claws on them. Maybe not a backpack, because you can't retrieve those. You know what I mean? You have a baldric with several longswords with owlbear claws on them. And you just, every time you crit, you quick draw out next an owlbear claw longsword that now still has the owlbear claw. So there's a lot of things that you can do there in terms of getting talismans. Longstrider points out that some talismans have requirements that might be difficult to use. That is particularly an issue when an adventure drops a random talisman.
Like, and if you have to have a certain proficiency to use it.
Yes. And if you're the GM, you may want to consider whether or not you want to change one that your group does not have proficiency in, just for fun. But the ones that require proficiency often let you do something interesting, and I like the ones that are like, you can have this feat that you don't have, but if you already have it, it's going to do something else. So,
yeah,
looking through talismans, try to find one that has a good, like, get out of jail free effect for you for either your off or a good, like, kicker effect on your offense.
Yeah. And
just affix one that's much lower level than you.
So, like, the emergency disguise from the Pathfinder Society guide is a good example of one that has a like, do you have this feat type thing that lets you quickly pop together a disguise, and you can impersonate, but you take a circumstance penalty because you just threw it together. But if you have the quick disguise feat, you don't take that penalty. So the fact that you have a related feat is playing into it.
That's right. So that's a perfect example. And there are other examples where you can wind up needing to be, like, proficient or expert in a particular skill,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is going to give you some kind of benefits with that skill, or possibly give you a bonus on the skill, or even in some cases turn like a success in a critical success, or remove the chance of a failure, or of a critical failure, and turn it into a failure. So those can always be helpful. For example, Crying Angel Pendant costs 7 gold pieces. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's a free action triggered when you critically fail to administer first aid, and it turns into a normal failure.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you something. When you have someone who's dying 3,
And you critically fail.
and you
don't
critically
want-
fail,
You want to
with 7 gold pieces for the Crying Angel Pendant is a lot less than the cost of a raised dead.
Yes.
Or just them being dead. So there's a lot of situations where a talisman can wind up being a good backup plan. When you're looking into that, try to look for talismans like the Crying Angel Pendant that triggers after you need the backup plan, as opposed to if you're looking for backup plans, the Bronze Bull Pendant does not give you a great backup plan due to the fact that you have to use it when you're making an athletics check to shove. So the Bronze Bull Pendant gives you a +2, but you have to use it in advance. So you can't use it as a contingency for a critical failure. Not that a critical failure on a shove matters quite as much as it does on a first aid when you're trying to save someone from dying.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to decide whether you want to use that talisman slot. It's not exactly a slot. For a contingency plan, or for something you're going to actively use. And that can change as you level up. Because a contingency plan, even at somewhat lower levels, a contingency plan to not kill someone on a administer first aid,
It's going to be really
it's going to be
useful.
worth 7 gold. Whereas at higher levels, being able to get a +2 on all your important shoves could be useful. Especially if you have that feat that every time you do a shield block, you get a free shove. So you know you're going to be doing a shove. You might as well get a critical when you want to shove them a little farther away
And then
from you.
plan to have a bag of them and affix them and fix them before encounters.
Right, and it can be more annoying for your enemy if you have, like, let's say a shield that can do that auto push on a shield block, a one-handed reach weapon, and attack of opportunity. Because if you crit the shove, they shove 10 feet, and then they need to not step to get back to you, and you're going to hit them again. So there's a lot of ways you can do this. Another example is the Mesmerizing Opal. Take a look at that. It gives you a critical failure into a failure on a feint, or a success to a critical success. For a normal feint, that's not a huge deal, but if you're a scoundrel rogue, then getting a critical success means you can make all of your allies' attacks work more effectively. So for certain characters who do more or different things on a feint, it just says feint. It doesn't say when you feint to do the basic feint benefits.
Yeah.
So take a look at talismans and decide, do you want them to be a sort of all the time thing? Do you want them to be a contingency thing? And even as a contingency, they can be worth it sooner, because you know you're not going to need to use them unless you really feel that you have to. So that is talismans. Now Fulu are basically a set of things that are either talismans or they're not, because you stick them like on your kitchen counter so it doesn't flood.
Yes.
And those are technically not talismans because they're not really affixed to a piece of inventory. They are just like in the room.
Like, for example, the magical lock fulu, which you affix to a door, window, or container to create a magical lock, even if it has no latch or other
That's right.
means to secure it.
So they basically are like talismans, except for that there's some that aren't. None of our tips really changed based on whether it's a Fulu or a different talisman. So let's move on to gadgets. So gadgets are one of the types of item that very explicitly has a character who can just make them in not in as much abundance as alchemical items, which can be made in just like an absolutely outlandishly large amount, but you can still make a pretty good number of gadgets as an inventor.
One of the things looking at gadgets is that you're going to see gadgets are going to be uncommon or rare.
And that's because the inventor class is uncommon, and all these gadgets are pretty high tech. You're going to want to look for gadgets that you think are, just like with talismans, are things that you're going to want to be using. Gadgets, on the other hand, if you get them from the feats, you can just pick something that's sort of a bread and butter ability. Even if you buy them though, some of them like blast boots are worth it because you interact with them and then you suddenly like high jump or long jump like a certain amount, and at higher levels possibly you can do some ridiculous things with them. So take a look at them. There's also things like ablative armor plating, which is going to give you some temporary hit points.
Then those ones are ones that you that last for a short duration of time, or until they've been used. So unlike with talismans, where like, oh yeah, you got to make sure you fix them in advance. For these ones, you're gonna want to think about, for the ones that you choose when to activate them, have those affixed in advance, or set up in advance like talismans. Whereas for the ones that are, then there's ones that are more like, okay, you really want to think about like, is this the encounter that I want to say this is where I'm gonna use this item.
Also, consider getting gadget skates so you can say, go, gadget skates! Just because that can be fun. So that's gadgets. Let's take a look. I realized that the list of things we were looking at did not include alchemical items. Because they were not listed under consumable magic items. So alchemical items are a whole other, like, ballywig. There's the entire alchemist class, which gets, like, honestly too many of them. And therefore they have like some different a whole different ambiance to them than some of the other items, because of the fact that there's a class that could make like 60 of these. There's a whole different set of types of alchemical items that we can go through as well, like when we're talking about ammunition, which we're going to do next. There's both magical and alchemical ammunition.
Yes.
There's also
alchemical bombs.
Yep, which are basically a type of consumable weapon. There's alchemical elixirs, which are kind of like an alchemical potion. Alchemical plants, which are a one-use type of alchemical item that are in the form of plants. Poisons, which you can just apply to a bunch of weapons and buff up your weapon use. Same thing that I said about the swords and the talismans applies to poison. You can have a bunch of poisoned and talisman swords that you just keep drawing with quick draw. Alchemical tools, which are like kind of a sort of an other category, except for there's also alchemical other, which is another category. And
things that don't
drugs, which are a type of poison that sometimes have a benefit.
Yeah, tools would be things like, you know,
smoke stick.
The smoke stick, exactly. Or a sunrise, like, oh, you know, we want to create light, you want to create some concealment, we can just pop those things out. It's kind of like it's just that the sorting is you know, is that created by magic or is it created by alchemy?
Yes. So my suggestion for alchemical items is to look at some of the very low level alchemy items like mist form elixir, or some of those other ones that can provide you a pretty decent benefit, and you might just want to make those. But in a lot of cases, the high-level alchemical items you should probably leave to the alchemist, because the alchemist can make, like, 50 of those and every day, and you cannot possibly afford 50 high-level alchemical items.
There's also the category drugs, but that's more of like
basically poisons that sometimes have a beneficial effect for a while, and then they don't.
Yeah, and it really depends on your game if you want to have those in there. Like, we generally don't have those in organized play, but like for a lot of games, they could be something that you want to explore.
So, looking at magical ammunition and alchemical ammunition. Ammunition is a cool way to boost your attacks with ranged weapons. Now, you're going to want to make a distinction between ammunition that has a free action activation and ammunition that does not have a free action activation. You might even look at ammunition and be like, wait, these are the same level. Why does this one do much more damage than that one? Generally, it's because the one that did more or seemed flashier had a cost to the activation that was not a free action.
So then you'll want to think about, like, you know, what is your character's build? How do they like spending their actions? Are they someone who already has, like, oh, yeah, you know, I'm gonna be doing like a bardic performance, or I'm gonna be doing like one of these other types of things, so my actions are a little more spoken for? Or are they someone who often is like, I'm not quite sure how I'm gonna spend my third action? They can be a really great option for how to spend a third action if for those more action ones, or if you're someone who has more constraint and what you like to do in your action builds, then you'll probably want to go for those free ones.
Another great tip, and also warning to third-party authors, because yeah, we kind of left a landmine for everybody in the game, but it's a great tip for players' direction, is that the Eldritch Archer archetype can just infinitely make, I think it's level 4 or below, magical ammunition. And so it does have like an additional action cost, so it's not completely free, but if you make something that could be broken by it being spammed literally every time that anybody takes a turn, it can be. As a player, if you find something that can be spammed by being used literally every turn that's level 1 through 4, then you can. So take a look at that. For alchemical ammunition, if you have a friendly neighborhood alchemist, then you can wind up getting a ton of very strong alchemical ammunition. So find your favorite alchemical ammunition and try to convince your party alchemist, if you're not the alchemist, if you're, say, the gunslinger, to make a bunch of them for you if they can allot some of their daily resources to it. Obviously, at low levels, alchemists don't have a lot of daily uses of their alchemy abilities. They're kind of a class that like scales at a much different rate than everybody else, because they get tons more uses of their highest level stuff at higher levels. So at higher levels, they probably don't know what to do with all of their alchemical items, and you can get some really good deals from your alchemist. At lower levels, they're gonna be like, no, I'm not giving you I'm not giving you one of my like few daily resources. So realize that it changes over the course of the game. Look for types of arrows and bullets and other things like that that not only just do damage, but that can also create additional effects. Like, if your GM is foolish enough to use the pre-errata, whatever the tangling shot thing is that got errated on day 1 of Treasure Vault, to not be as busted as it was, then you automatically win if you have them, because on a critical success, the opponent is pretty much screwed. And you can just buy a bunch of those and just keep shooting them at people, and they are, even if they are big boss, they're done. Because even on a critical success, they were slowed 1 until they spent an action to remove it and succeeded at a check that a boss was going to succeed at, but that's essentially slowed 2, or like if they roll a 1, maybe slowed 3. And if you just keep shooting that and doing the slowed 2, then that's done. So hopefully you will use the errata for that particular ammunition, but if your group decides, no, we don't use any errata, including day 1 errata, buy as many of those as you can, I guess, because they are boss killers.
So another thing to consider with these is with this sort of magical and alchemical ammunition is whether or not the effects that you're looking at have DCs, and then how that impacts when you're and how you're going to want to use it.
That's right. The one I was talking about both had a DC, and DCs don't scale. And not only did it have a DC, but it was incapacitation. But since its critical success effect was still, like, completely messed up the opponent for a single round, you could continue to fire it. Normally, an incapacitation item, which has a non-scaling DC, is going to be an issue. Now, alchemical items do allow your friendly local alchemist to use their alchemist DC, and that can help you out.
Yeah. But otherwise, that does mean that you probably, for these kinds of magical ammunition, are going to want to use them sooner in the character's career, when those DCs are going to be more potent.
It happened again.
It did?
It happened again.
It's still looking
okay. Wait, no,
on
I
our
can
end.
see it on our end. Nightbeer,
this is not the same error.
Nightbeer, are you sure that that we dropped?
Can other folks see us still?
I can see both the sound. Oh, no, it was just Nightbeer. Okay. Whew.
Okay.
Okay. So I mean, I'm not glad it happened to you, Nightbeer, but I'm glad that it didn't happen to everybody else.
Way. Yeah. So for those ones, yeah, using them relatively sooner in the character's career, when those DCs are still going to be more likely to have like more of a punch, and also as you get to the later points, using them more on like the weaker minion creatures rather than saving them for the boss.
And if you wind up not finding a good place to use them, sell them, because their DC doesn't scale, and eventually you're gonna want to sell it off.
Yeah, so the DCs are another way to the sort of design space that helps to counteract that issue of like completely stocking up on lots of them, because those items are going to become less potent over time. So you'll want to use them when you find a good way to use them shortly after you get them, when they're going to be at their most valuable.
That's right. Like, for instance, that item, the one that I talked about, that the initial version was just like basically as long as you can hit with your ranged attack and you stock up on them, you win. Just simply by making its critical success effect be no effect, it immediately caused that to not be the case. Because by the time you can stock a ton of them, opponents are going to hit incapacitation. They're going to critically succeed almost all the time. So that is sort of an in-game balancing factor that can help to make up for that. So let's take a look at potions, elixirs.
Oh, I do want to do one thing as an example of one that's that doesn't have like a DC that you're going to be dealing with a lot. Like, for example, there's climbing bolt from the core rulebook, which is basically I'm going to fire a bolt, I'm going to create a rope, and then we can climb that rope. So that's an example of something that's going to be evergreen.
There's actually a lot that don't throw a DC afterwards that are just like, oh, it's climbing, or it lights it up, or it deals some extra damage just automatically on the hit without a saving throw afterwards, or it leaves behind something on the ground. So look for those if you were looking for evergreen arrows. And of course, if you have the ability to just shoot out magic arrows over and over again with Eldritch Archer, then even if it is a sort of Hail Mary pass, you can still attempt it. So potions and elixirs are consumables that you drink, and you generally get an effect for a certain amount of time. They tend to have a one-action interact, mainly because people are thinking, how could it take more than one action to just drink down a potion? And because of that, potions can sometimes be very powerful if you carry them around in your hand. Like, sometimes they can give you effects that are essentially akin to a quickened spell. So, for example, especially if you're a freehand character or a monk who's just like, oh yeah, I just kick with my dragon-style tail, with my leg, I can just have 2 potions or whatever.
Yeah.
You can, for one action, do a potion of swiftness at higher levels that is basically haste, except it only took 1 action instead of 2, is assuming that you had the potion out already. And at higher levels, you can just have those and, like, drink one every fight unless it looks so easy that you don't have to.
So one thing on the items and such is even if it's not an item that like has to be pre-affixed, it's very valuable from an action economy perspective to make sure that you've decided who is carrying each of your items, because if your consumables are in the rogue storage bag and they're not like distributed out where people can easily use them, then you're going to run into, oh crap, well, I'm not holding that, I guess I can't use it. So
that's right.
Once you get them, distribute them so that you can use them, and consider, updating that distribution every once in a while in case things changed.
That's right. And Nightbear puts out a glove of storing is a good way to get more of them available for you in the same way. That's absolutely true. It can be expensive at lower levels. At higher levels, you might want to pull one out. Also, for groups that are just like, listen, we know what Linda just said, that you should divide them out, but we just can't. Like, we can't remember to divide them out, or it just takes so much time and effort, nobody wants to do it, but we'd like to use consumables. You could consider talking to your group and your GM and just being like, can we do this like, one of a JRPG where it just, there's a list of things that says potion times 12. And then on anybody's turn, they can use one of the potions times 12. Does it make sense? No, because how could everybody have all 12 of the potions? But if for your group, maybe it's not worth the time and effort to figure it out. Now, obviously, at that point, you might run into bulk issues, but you may not be tracking bulk anyway with such a group, or you could just say, all right, you know what, there's a limit to how much the person with lower bulk can pull out during a fight from the shared potion resource. That's something you're going to have to decide together with the GM and the other players, though.
Yeah, that could be treated, I imagine, as somewhat of a oh, well, we always had it this way, we just didn't decide it until that moment. Like some of those abilities that are like pulling out just the right item at the right time.
That's right.
So that could be sort of your group's explanation for it. And then that sort of that bulk limit could be like, okay, well, you can't say that you were holding more than you would have been able to. That makes me think of like Blades in the Dark, how it has that mechanic where it's like, oh, you can say, oh, yes, I totally had this all along, but
In fact, that's the only way to carry inventory in Blades in the Dark.
Yeah.
You say how much you're carrying, that determines how easy people can tell that you are a person who's about to kill them. But you then retroactively pull out exactly the things that you need at the moments you need. Or it's like, I was wearing a vest when you get hit by an attack. So the difference between potions and elixirs is that elixirs are alchemical. Generally, there are some really good elixirs, like Mistform Elixir. You can look for longer lasting ones. Bravo's Brew can be good at certain levels. Potions are typically going to have some of the more outlandish effects because there's nobody in the game who can like make 50 of them. But you still might be able to find some really good elixirs that can help you out as well. Now, in terms of things that are very similar to potions and elixirs, but you technically don't drink them, we can be looking at things like oils and alchemical plants.
Yes.
So plants, like, you usually, like, eat or consume the plant or rub it like a salve, and oils, like, you put onto generally an object.
Yes.
They still are a consumable that generally has an effect for a duration that is a sort of a buffing kind of effect. Not always, especially the plants have a variety of things they can do.
So like oil of mending, put it on an object and then it'll cast a second level mending spell to repair the item.
That's right. No, Nightmare, you're not supposed to drink the oils. They're not for drinking. And they're not a suppository. So, all the tips about potions and elixirs are pretty true about oils as well. So when we looking at scrolls are a very interesting item, and they are sort of the baseline high bar, most expensive / valuable consumable for their level, because they just give you another spell of basically the same level that as the highest level spell a spellcaster could cast.
Yes.
Now, if you're looking at scrolls versus wands, a lot of people are like, wait a minute, this scroll only costs 1/4 as much as a permanent item of my level. That's ridiculous. I could, like, get a wand and cast 4 fireballs so easily over 4 days. The thing is that wands that can cast a fireball are not the same level as scrolls that can cast a fireball.
Yes.
They're actually 2 levels higher. They cost around 8 times as much as a scroll. So you would need to actually use the wand on 8 different occasions before it can have the same value as the scroll, and you don't have the ability to spam on the same day. The wand just is like, oh, I've used it, now it's done for
Whereas
the day.
with scrolls, you could say, okay, I'm going to bring, for the same cost, I'm going to bring 8 copies of this scroll to
And then if
fight.
I need 3 in this day, or even the same fight, and then 3 later on, and then 2 later on, now you've spent the same amount of money, but with the wand, you just didn't have them the other times.
So scrolls are great for spells that you don't have that you know you're going to need, as well as spells that you look at and you're like, we're not going to need that often, but when we need that spell, we're really going to need it.
Yes. Scrolls basically give you more spells per day, so get a lot of scrolls of spells that are evergreen, that are never going to be a bad spell for you to have around. Ones that you're going to be like, oh yeah, I'd be happy casting a 3rd level fear spell always. Like, level 16, I mean, I'm not going to be thrilled with casting a 3rd level fear spells, and I have 8 level spells, but I'd probably be okay with casting a 3rd level fear spell if I didn't have anything else to do.
Yeah.
Just fear a bunch of enemies. And at that point, a scroll of 3rd level fear is basically nothing.
Yeah. Or things like, water breathing that are like, okay, yeah, we know we're going to need to go into an underwater adventure. We need to have a way to deal with this particular issue.
Absolutely.
Or, and once you get into the higher levels where it's less expensive, having some of those types of things as a contingency plan. So that you're not going to be stuck in a situation where you're like, oh, crud. If you have a spell where the wizard's like, well, that spell could be useful, but like most of the time I'm not going to need it, so I don't really want to prepare it, but what do? That's where scrolls can really shine.
So scrolls, like talismans and gadgets and potions, they're a way to get a few of them from class feats, but scrolls are more limited than the others. Even the scroll trickster class feats that let you make scrolls do have a limit where it's like one scroll of this level and then a scroll of the lower level than that, and that's because they essentially are spell slots. So they scale fairly similarly to caster archetypes, except that they let you cast from all 4 traditions, and so they generally scale Slightly slower than that.
Oh, Nightmare is an awesome example of using scrolls. Using like 10 scrolls of lock to take apart an encounter by separating all the enemies.
Awesome.
That's really cool.
So, other than other consumables, which is just like all sorts of other things, the last type of magic consumable is spell catalysts. Much like spell catalysts are very similar to magical ammunition in that there's something you can pull out while you're doing the thing, in this case casting a spell instead of shooting a bow or a gun, and that they sometimes have a free action activation and sometimes they don't. And depending on if they do or not, it has a huge effect on what you should expect to get out of them. Because the ones that have a one-action activation are essentially like a one-action meta magic that you're paying for. And the ones that have a free action activation are just like, you could, theoretically, if you have enough money, do this every single time you ever cast the spell. Now, spell catalysts, in general, they either might do some weird random effect, or they might make the spell better at what it does. If they do make the spell better at what it does, they often... especially if they're like, this gives you more damage on your fireball or more healing on your healing spell, they often have a limit on only letting you use them on like a 3rd level heal unless you buy the higher level version of the catalyst. That's because of the fact that that's another one of the ways to deal with the fact that eventually consumables don't cost anything. So you don't really want there to be like a 3 gold piece item that makes all of your 10th level heal spells be significantly more powerful, because otherwise all 10th level heal spell
significantly more powerful.
Well, yeah, you're basically just like, especially if it has a free action activation, just be like, cleric, you're expected to have 100 of these for 300 gold. That's like nothing by the time you have 10th level heals in your font, and just every time you would use.
And if it's capped to the lower level ones, then that does mean that does mean that you can use it you can definitely use it effectively to bolster out of combat healing. It's not going to be used to like dramatically swing the power of the kinds of heals that you're going to be throwing out as in a battle.
That's right. So some of them don't have that issue where you need to have a lesser or greater, because they just do a side thing. And so it's just like Soothing Sense. For 10 gold pieces, when you're going to do a Soothe spell, it reduces Frightened by 1. Like, that's an example of a contingency item, because Soothe also gives a bonus on saves against mental effects and heals. So let's say you're fighting something that attacks you with mental effects and deals damage. Let's say it has Phantasmal Killer. Let's say you're fighting multiple things, like several animate dreams. And so, like, your party fighter gets hit with a Phantasmal Killer, takes a bunch of damage, is now frightened too. You go. You're the bard. There's another animate dream coming next. If you soothe the fighter, you're not only healing their damage, you're giving them a +2 against mental effects. And if with Soothing Sense, you reduce the fear by 1. That's going to give them a net of 3 towards not being, like, killed by the next Phantasmal Killer.
Yes.
Because once you've been Phantasmal Killered once, your penalty means you're more likely to be killed by the next Phantasmal Killer. So, these are good examples of things
general,
that you can do.
Even outside of that, in general, like, reducing the frightened condition is very good.
Oh, yeah. That's an example of one where it could save your life, but there's also situations where you might want to do that for other reasons.
Because, you're going to want to have more, you're going to want to be more effective in combat, you're going to not want to be as vulnerable to other effects.
Yep. So take a look at what the different, what your favorite spell is, check to see if it has a catalyst, see what the catalyst does, and see if that means you want to get one of that catalyst to just hold on as a backup plan, or if you want to actually buy a bunch of lower level catalysts for your spells if you can. If you can't, then you still might want to consider getting one catalyst that hits you on some of the higher level versions of the spells, just in case you wind up casting your favorite spell at a very high level. So, for example, you could get a high level fire starter pellet and do 3d6 persistent damage on your fireball. Also note that fire starter pellets have scaling versions, but you don't actually need to use the higher level ones on a higher level fireball. So even if you're casting a 9th level fireball for some reason, you could still, for just 25 gold, add 1d6 persistent damage, and at that level, that's not that much money. The reason being is that a 9th level fireball is probably worse than casting another 9th level attack spell, and so it didn't need to have that scaling that I was talking about when it was designed.
Yeah.
Whereas a 9th level heal is still the best heal spell. There's not like a uber heal that's actually better in the same way that like some of the innately higher level damaging spells are actually better. And so therefore I believe that the higher level versions of the healer's gel you are required, I think, to use them to get let me see. Oh no, you aren't, because it gives a smaller number of hit points. It doesn't scale. That's what it is. So
there's sort of those two different factors. Does the effect scale, or do you need to use a more powerful one to affect a higher level spell?
Exactly. So take a look at those. Now, last but not least are going to be alchemical poisons, which we did touch into slightly.
There's also snares.
Oh, right, snares. Snares just weren't in either of these because they're their own category of thing. So let's do chemical poisons and then snares. Snares are interesting too because like they're so often received for free. So alchemical poisons can sometimes be very powerful, but almost always it's with alchemist class, because alchemists are going to scale their DC, and they always have a DC. Now their DC is actually sometimes high. It can often be higher than the item DC for the item's level. And therefore, when you first get a poison, it's often above the alchemist. It may be above the alchemist's actual DC at first, but you can scale it to keep it relevant. And alchemists can just have so many that they can throw it onto a bunch of items. Now, there's also a thing about like the duration and potency of poisons with respect to like, what do you do when you're putting on a poison that only lasts for a very, very short amount of time, but then you've actually used it and put it on the weapon? Does it still last? And in general, that's something that is not answered by the rules, but I think that everyone can realize that you're not meant to be able to, when you have perpetual poisons, so that you can have literally an infinite number of them, literally make an infinite number of things that just last indefinitely.
Yeah.
That are all poisoned. But you're gonna have to figure out with your group how you're gonna rule that one, because of the fact that technically you've activated it by that point in time, and so it's got some little squidgy things with duration on those perpetual poisons. The main thing with poisons is don't get too invested in each individual poison working, but if you have poison that's just stuck onto everything, especially if there's an archer, if you're doing that sword and shield thing with lots of swords like I was talking about before, or just if you're an alchemist and you put one on each of your martial characters, over the course of all of those poisons,
poison arrows.
Yeah, for an archer, for example. Over the course of all those poisons, you're going to do some nasty things to your enemy, because eventually they're going to fail.
Yeah. And poisons are typically going to have a combination of damage and condition. Some combination of damage and negative condition.
That's right. So consider diversifying the negative conditions, especially if you've got something like a baldric full of swords or a quiver full of arrows. So it's like once you land the poison that does enfeebled or clumsy, you can then start doing the poison that does the other one.
Yeah.
And especially if you can land a poison with drained, that will lower their fortitude save, which makes it easier to put the other poisons on people.
So the order matters.
It can, like, giving someone a bunch of different poisons, all of which they're dealing with while also being drained, is just absolutely obnoxious and hilarious. So you should definitely do that.
It says, are we including also including alchemist poison as one that stays if it's injury? Is the question.
I'm not sure what that question means. That may be talking about the thing that I already brought up, which is like the ambiguity about if you like dose someone's food with poison but don't actually make them drink it, or put it on the weapon but don't actually hit people, can it last indefinitely? And like I don't think very many, it doesn't seem very reasonable to rule that way, but also there's some timing issues on using perpetual poisons. If you don't give at least some grace period, you might want to give like one extra round of grace period, because like you use it and then you can't attack with it, and then it runs out of duration. So you're gonna have to figure that one out, because the specific rules don't exactly give you an answer on that. So let's move on to
Snares?
snares. So with snares, basically the thing about snares is once you've built them, they're a trap. You don't just
Mm-hmm.
like have a completed pit trap in your backpack.
Yes.
That doesn't make any sense. So snares are the item in the game, the only item in the game that you can always craft super quickly. And when I say super quickly, it still takes way too long unless you have a lot of prepared time to set one up before a fight because it takes minutes. But that's still way faster than any other crafting.
Yeah, but that does mean that, for example, if you know where a fight is going to take place, like say for example, because you are the one who's being attacked, or you're able to sneak into an area and help prepare it, like, oh, I'm going to sneak in here the night before and set things up. They require more thought and preparation than a lot of other items for that reason, but then their effects can be
Yes. Snares often have
quite potent.
a very high amount of damage due to the fact that the enemy has to step on it, and they might not do it. That means that if you can combine, first of all, if you get the feats, you can do snares really fast, and that's why I mentioned that compared to the other items, snares are used almost exclusively by people who have the feats because they can deploy them faster, or because the number of times you can actually build a snare and you know where the fight's going to be in advance are low enough that they aren't tended to be used by people who don't have a way to do it quickly, especially since you need a snare crafter feat to craft them. If there wasn't a feat, I think some people would just like be, oh, this is the once in a campaign chance to set up tons of traps and the enemies have to come to us, then they would build it. But since it requires a feat, it's rarely used by the people who don't have them for free.
Unless you're using something like the alarm snare, or some of those other snares that are about like, oh, we're camping for the night, let's set this up.
Right.
If you're like camping for the night in a dangerous area, there's certain
problem with that is that then you've spent money and you might not have an encounter.
Yeah.
Which is sort of one of the issues. Now, with snares, because snares actually do just like a lot of damage, some of these things, you may want to consider combining snares with forced movement, such as shoves, or even the first level spell Lose the Path. On a critical failure, you get to decide where their path is, and it could be, I think, a snare. Maybe it says you can't put them into dangerous spots. Let me check before you officially say that that's a tip. No, you can't do that. Never mind.
You can't do that yet.
But you can shove them into it, which is funnier. I mean, it makes sense that a first level spell wouldn't let you just cause someone to take massive amounts of snare damage. Lose the Path is still ridiculously powerful.
Lose the Path is still awesome. Yeah, but you can definitely set things up with areas like choke points, or like, oh yeah, you're gonna try to get them to attack this one person, or and another thing with them is that once the enemy has seen like one or two snares goes off, they can get really worried about going in a particular direction, and that can definitely impact their tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they're mindless, they might just not realize that and just run into a huge number of snares. It can be very satisfying to watch the enemy bounce into like all of your snares. Like even literally last night, I was playing Triangle Strategy and I had up like 10 traps on the field that I'd set up, and the enemies came over and they just kept being knocked backwards for days. And it's a lot of fun and satisfying to set up the trap and to have it go off because of the whole idea that you prepared in advance. But it can be frustrating if the enemies go around it, especially if the GM, if you've actually set it in advance and the enemies don't know where it is, and the GM metagames and just swerves around it for some reason, and you're like, why did you not go in a straight line? Like, I felt like it.
Yeah, so snares are not like, imagine, the enemy would need to like actually be able to notice it to reasonably go around it.
Now, granted, when you're making them during the fight, I mean, people are gonna see that you
did
just
that,
like
yes.
made the let's see, flying blade wheel trap where you made a deadly flying wheel of spinning blades and put them into that square, or the instant evisceration snare where an unbelievable number of
place.
swords deal 24d8 piercing damage. Like, that is a lot,
lot
of swords that
yes.
you just put in there. It's also 24d8. That's what I'm saying about snares doing a huge amount of damage. Like, I think they're going to notice that you just stuffed that many swords into the square. So that can be an issue with deploying them during a fight. But sometimes you could make it annoying for them. You could do it while they're not looking or when they're not able to see. If you have an ability to be invisible, for example. There's a lot of ways that you can be very sneaky and do that. Turgeman VT points out AI does not know how to counter traps when you're playing it in like an RPG like Triangle Strategy, where they just move straight forward onto your trap, and that is absolutely true. Whereas the GM kind of knows that the traps are there. So Turgeman is wondering, how do you make it feel good for the GM too to be up against them, snares or things like that. Honestly, just in general, if you somehow find a way to trap every battlefield in advance with like tons and tons of snares, I think like maybe it could get frustrating, but that happens a few enough times that you're probably not going to be able to get up enough snares to the point that I think it's going to be a GM frustration. So I think that's something you don't have to worry about, because if the GM gave you the opportunity to set up like a tower defense set of snares in a particular battle, they're probably going to feel like it's fun and cool that you got to use all of your snares because they wanted you to do that time. It's not something you'll be able to do more than like a few times, or like maybe you have a strategy to get enemies to rush you, but that could combine encounters as well. So there's a lot of ways that I think that the GM sort of has control over whether you have a lot of time to put a ton of them out. And if there's only one of snare, they're strong, but I don't think that they're like frustratingly strong compared to other abilities. They're just like a little bit, if you can consistently get enemies to stand on them, they're a little bit stronger damage-wise than some of the other options. But then you also probably spent resources or effort to get the enemies to walk on them. Turgeman VT says that they'd rather have the GM be surprised by the trap. Like, maybe there's a way to create a Foundry module that allows players to sneakily add snares that the other players in the GM can't see.
I could see doing it in physical space with like cards that like some of them say trap on the other side, and the player, and then like as the enemies move forward, like the GM flips the cards and the like fine, and this was like trap.
Dun dun dun. Yeah, you could do that, especially if you trap them in advance.
Yeah.
If you trap them during a fight, it may be actually difficult to do that, because it may be difficult to put down a fake card, because the GM will know, hey, wait a minute, you took 3 actions worth of actions this turn. You didn't have enough actions to put out a snare. Whereas, and even if you're, let's say, playing Foundry and the GM's like, the Ranger suspiciously didn't really fire any arrows. I bet they put out a snare. You still don't know which square they put the snare in. If you did that. Now, if you had it in advance, yeah, you could put down the cards, or you could even have the player create a secondary map that they write out that puts X's on all of the traps,
and then show you the map, and it's like, oh, that was a
trap. They show you that section of the map to show that you walked on the trap or something like that. Elf is saying, since the GM is the owner of everything, it may not be possible to override that in Foundry. Yeah, I don't think you can do it just with base Foundry. You might have to write a module or something, and I am not an expert at all in Foundry and have never written a module for it, so you may be right that it's impossible to even write a module that allows the GM to put in things that they are not the owner of and that they can't see. That's why I said you might be able to.
But there may be a way to, for example, have like a player notes that then the player can share. Oh yeah, make a note in the simple calendar that the GM can't see.
Oh, well, that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
It would be even more fun if you could automate it. That would require some significant coding, if it's even possible, where you automate it so the GM walks on it and suddenly the snare goes off and the GM's like, whoa, I hit a snare. But the note on the calendar could potentially suffice, and then you could reveal the note, and they could see that there was a trap there. So yeah, that's snares and the rest of hazards. Not hazard. The rest of consumables.
Consumable items, yes.
So, hopefully this gave you some tips and thoughts as a player with the consumable. Just remember, if you just still are like, no, I just have trouble using it because I've lost value and it feels like a value sink and I want to keep my stuff, try to get your GM to work with you with gardens from the treasure vault and other things like that, and just don't buy them. You don't have to. But consumables are actually very strong if you use them and curate them well. Even talismans, the ones that people sometimes overlook the most. So make sure to look into ways to use them the way you want, whether that's per day with feats and gardens, or whether that's true consumables that you can have as a contingency plan, or that you can have when there's a hard fight as a way to throw a little bit of gold into it with a lower level consumable. That's it from us. So let's say goodbye to YouTube and then do an outro with all of you on Twitch. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye!